Remote-controlled toys. Believe it or not, remote-controlled toys had their beginnings as weapons of war. In 1866, Englishman Robert Whitehead was given the job of development of a means whereby Her Majesty can blow up a ship from a goodly distance from the ship. After several months of work, Whitehead came up with a primitive torpedo, a small boat stuffed with explosives and steered by wires attached to the motor. To test the new device, a rusty old ship was towed into range, in this case, a couple of miles away. All was ready for the big test. Alas, the first torpedo bombed. The torpedo boat blew up before reaching its target, but all was not lost. In fact, something good came out of this flop. British toy manufacturers, hearing of Whitehead's torpedo boat, made use of the idea. Soon, English children could be seen playing with miniature battery-powered boats steered by wires connected to a simple control system. During World War I, 1914 to 1918, the Germans more or less reinvented Whitehead's weapon. Motorboats packed with explosives were developed by the German Navy to ram enemy ships. Since radio waves rather than wires were used, the boats were the first true remote-controlled devices in history. Like Whitehead's invention, the German weapon was converted into a toy. In the 1920s, a few radio-controlled toy boats and cars appeared on the market. By the 1950s, there were thousands. Throughout World War II, 1939 to 1945, the Germans invented all sorts of bizarre weapons. There was the flying tank, an idea that never got off the ground, and the wind cannon, which was supposed to knock down enemy planes with big blasts of air, another unworkable idea. Strangest of all may have been the Goliath. The Goliath was a little tank, one so small not even a single person could fit inside. Instead of soldiers, the Goliath carried explosives. The idea was to send the radio-controlled miniature tank in the direction of the enemy. Once it had reached its target, it was detonated by the soldier operating the controls. Though hundreds of Goliaths were made during the war, not one is reported to have caused much damage. Rarely did these mini-tanks even come close to reaching their targets. Most got stuck in the mud or crashed into an obstacle and flopped over. The rest, as they slowly rumbled along, were shot to pieces and stopped in their tracks. Remote-controlled miniature airplanes were used by the armies of many countries during World War II. As with torpedo boats and mini-tanks, the small planes were sometimes filled with explosives and guided by a controller toward the enemy. Other remote-controlled planes had cameras mounted on their bellies. As they were flown over hostile territory, the camera snapped reconnaissance photos to spy on the enemy. Ultimately, remote-controlled miniature planes were not very successful in achieving either of their wartime goals. But, after the war, in the 1950s, miniature planes were reconceived as remote-controlled toys. During the 1960s, and in the following decades, a wide variety of new remote-controlled toys came onto the scene. Robots were the newest addition, with Mr. Atom leading the way. Toy rockets, spaceships, and lunar vehicles soon followed. How do remote-controlled toys work? Take a look at a remote-controlled toy car, for example. Inside the car is a battery that provides power for what is called the drive motor. There is a steering motor, steering control arms, and a radio receiver attached to an antenna. This antenna picks up radio signals from an antenna on the control panel in the user's hands. The control panel is a radio transmitter. Signals from it go to the receiver in the car, telling it to speed up or slow down, go backward or forward, left or right. In many respects, remote-controlled toys are miniaturized versions of cars, planes, and boats. There is one important difference, however. Though remote-controlled toys are based on weapons technology, they are used for fun, not war. Remote-controlled devices that are familiar in many households include garage door openers, televisions, and DVD players. One of the most interesting uses of remote control is found in coal mining. Called a ROLF, remotely operated longwall face. The device directs the operation of a huge machine that cuts coal from the mine and loads it into a conveyor belt. Police and the military used remote-controlled robotic devices in extremely dangerous situations. These robots can be controlled to disarm or even detonate bombs. Toy soldiers. And sometimes, for an hour or so, I watched my leaden soldiers go, with different uniforms and drills, among the bedclothes through the hills. Robert Louis Stevenson. Boys in ancient Greece played with tiny clay gladiators riding in metal carriages pulled by wooden horses. In Europe, during the Middle Ages, boys played with wooden knights that had movable parts attached to strings. By having their strings manipulated, the little wooden puppet knights with swords, spears, and shields would do battle with each other. Most of the knights were in full armor, and often they were mounted on wheeled horses. As a child, King Louis XIII of France, 1601 to 1643, played with lead soldiers, which he placed in holes cut into a wooden board. When his son, Louis XIV, was 12, the king had the largest, most expensive set of toy soldiers made for him. The soldiers were solid silver and cost the equivalent of $35,000 to make. They are now worth several $million. Not to be outdone by his father, when Louis XIV grew up, he had a huge set of wind-up toy soldiers made in Germany for his son. The wind-up warriors went through all the basic wartime maneuvers. They marched to the left and to the right, doubled their ranks, fired toy guns, lowered their weapons, and then retreated. Tsar Peter II of Russia also had a very large set of toy soldiers made, but for himself, not his children. While the Tsar never led his troops into battle, he did spend a great deal of his time playing with his toy troops. Another ruler who was fond of collecting toy soldiers was Decebalus, the king of Dacia, now Romania. He had hundreds of life-size toy soldiers, all dressed in the uniform of the Dacian army. In AD 87, Decebalus received word that a large Roman army was advancing on his capital. Knowing they would be facing a superior force, the Dacian citizens and soldiers expected to be defeated. As the Romans came into view across a distant plain, King Decebalus suddenly had an idea. He ordered his people to lower his army of puppets over the city walls and move them about on the ground below. Viewing the huge army from afar and not realizing the soldiers were just toys, the Romans concluded they were greatly outnumbered and quickly retreated. Throughout history, there have been all kinds of toy soldiers made of almost every possible material: gold, silver, lead, wood, ceramic, even paper mache, and cardboard. Today, they are mostly made of plastic or synthetic rubber. 11.5 inches tall, fully jointed, and with 21 moving parts, G.I. Joe captured the toy soldier world in 1962. The idea for the product was based on a TV series, The Lieutenant. As for the name of the toy, it came from a World War II movie, The Story of G.I. Joe. By 1965, G.I. Joe was the best-selling toy among children 5 to 12 years old. And not just with boys. Girls also played with Joe. To date, more than 10 million G.I. Joes have been sold. A modern spin-off of toy soldiers are action figures, such as mountain climbers, martial artists, athletes, explorers, and astronauts. Their popularity took off with the release of the first Star Wars movie in 1977. Almost overnight, Han Solo, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Princess Leia action figures were surpassing G.I. Joe in toy sales. Although action figures are extremely popular, there is still great interest in toy soldiers. But the toy soldier collectors are now almost all adults. Kids usually collect action figures for only a few months, and then along comes the next action figure, who, for a time, becomes the latest and greatest. When China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi, died in 210 BC, he was buried with 8,000 life-size toy soldiers. After the American Civil War, toy soldiers were edible since they were made of sugar, chocolate, and flour paste. In the 1870s, while England and France were at war, many British bowling alleys featured 9 pins shaped like French soldiers. In the late 19th century in France, more than 5 million tin soldiers were made from discarded sardine containers. Before settling on G.I. Joe, the makers of the toy considered such names as Skip the Navy Frogman, Rocky the Marine Paratrooper, and Ace the Fighter Pilot. In 1967, a short-lived talking G.I. Joe went on the market. When kids yanked on his dog tags, he yelled out 8 battlefield commands. Thanks everyone for listening.